I'm just gonna.
Hello, everyone. We are on. We are live.
Okay, thank you for that.
Can Sana, Paola, Maytha, can you hear us? Can you wave your hand if you can hear us?
Yes. Hello.
Welcome, everybody. See you later.
Okay, thank you.
Peace.
Okay,
Thanks.
yay. I'm glad we were able to get that sorted, and we're all here connecting from many different locations. Maytha, where are you right now?
Southern California.
Southern California. And you, Paola?
I am in a taxi cab in New York City, so you'll have to forgive the movement. I'm trying to make it as steady as possible.
Real movement happening here as we talk about this. So welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Talking Inclusion series. This is an online talk about migration, inclusion, diversity, and we feature speakers from around the world and from different fields. So we're really excited to have you here today. This talk was organized by the 19 Million Project, 6 Degrees, and this is WorldTown. So today we're going to be talking about the experiences of migration through the gender lens. As most of us know, yesterday was World Refugee Day, and something that we see in this topic about refugee and migration, the gender lens is often missed, and we don't really understand fully what that experience looks like for women and for trans people and for anyone who has that gendered experience. We see a lot of men. We see a lot of different narratives that come out of it, but we don't often hear from people who are on the front line. And today's speakers, I'd like to introduce them. So Maytha Alhassen is a doctoral candidate, a journalist, and she is currently a TED resident. Her work in and outside of academia bridges the worlds of social justice, academic research, and artistic expression. Over the last 5 years, she has been a guest co-host / digital producer on Al Jazeera English's social media focused program, The Stream. And she has appeared as a guest on CNN, BET, Fusion, The Young Turks, and Pivot. Maytha has also written for CNN, Huffington Post, Mick, Counterpunch, La Vanguardia, academic journals, and other online and print publications. Paola Mendoza, who's in New York City, she's a filmmaker who made her narrative directorial debut with Entre Nos, and Miss Mendoza is in development for her second feature film, A Paso de Mangles, which she will direct in Colombia. Miss Mendoza has written and directed several short films. Most recently, she directed a short documentary series for Refinery 29 about immigration. And her short, Broken Tail Light, currently has over 12 million views on YouTube. She is also the author of a novel called The Ones Who Don't Stay, which was published by Penguin Books in 2013. So welcome to both of you. I want to get this conversation started. I just want to remind anyone who's tuning in that you can use the hashtag Talking Inclusion if you have questions for our guests. I will start with the first issue, the topic itself, which so often migration is relegated to a male-focused lens, and we often neglect that experience of women and trans bodies who take this journey. So what are some of the things that you have seen, and we'll start with you, Maytha, in this discussion that are specific to gender?
So the work that I've been doing most recently with migrations has been focused on refugees in Greece. So last October, November, I was in Athens, and one of the 3 islands that were previously housing, they're currently housing refugee camps, but they were previously called reception centers that were supposed to be points of transit for folks. So what was happening up until March 2016 was that people were coming in from the Middle East and Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and coming through these islands to try to make their way to Northwestern Europe. The myth was this was the gateway to asylum seeking in Germany. So what ended up happening was most of the time, the men were traveling this journey before the women and families so that they could get there and figure out some of the details with the dangers of the journey. But what ended up happening in March 2016 is that there was this EU-Turkey deal that was signed, which turned these transit points into temporary permanent stays. And a lot of the mothers with children who are trying to reconnect with their husbands or their partners in this journey got stuck there. So that's been one of the most frequent stories, is the women with their children coming, trying to reunite with their partners who are in different Northwestern European countries and finding a difficult time to make that journey. Obviously, I've heard even more stories, and especially how dangerous that route is. Women who've experienced sexual violence by their smugglers. Currently, there are stories that are emerging about prostitution and sex work, and something that was new to me in this work, survival sex, hearing about that. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the things that have been happening in terms of the dangers that women uniquely face, and also some of the hardships in terms of trying to communicate their stories of experiencing sexual or gender-based violence, because it is traumatizing and they're actually not getting psychological counseling for it. But there are some small centers, like one I work with in the island of Chios in Greece, called the Athena Women's Center, that is trying to tend to it. But for the most part, there's not a lot of funding and resources that are being put behind helping women. And then one other thing which is interesting, and I'll stop talking after that point, is I've been working with a midwife center in Athens, and they specialize in midwifery. And so that's also been a very interesting story, the kind of treatment or lack of treatment that women are getting, and the forced C-sections that women have been undergoing as refugees who are not accustomed to it. And Greece has one of the highest rates of C-sections in the whole world. So that has a lot to do with their economic crisis and how C-sections are frequently thought about as a cost-saving procedure.
Right, and I think that just highlights how many layers there are to this issue in particular, and how many different things come into play that we don't fully understand, and also just don't really have the numbers to understand how migration is gendered. So thank you for sharing that. I want to move to you, Paola, and speak specifically about your work that you've done with undocumented migrants, and especially in this climate in the United States right now, where, you know, this narrative of building walls and xenophobia has taken such a front seat. So I just want to see what you've seen in kind of this issue around gender and migration, especially when it comes to undocumented migrants.
You know, I think the most heartbreaking fact that we are living through right now is that the current administration has created such an atmosphere of fear, particularly fear for their children, are afraid that their parents are going to be stolen from them, because quite literally that is what the government is doing, is that they're stealing parents away from their children. And so with regards to this being looked at a gendered lens, mothers, the fabric of family is being ripped apart. And when these families are being ripped apart, you also have to look at how this will affect a generation of children. The psychological effect that will happen to these children, whether their parents are deported or not. There's still a sense of fear that is consistent. And if we're speaking honestly, yes, Donald Trump has been in office for the past 6 months, but also under the Obama administration, the deportations were actually the highest that they've ever been under any presidency. So the undocumented community has been living in fear for a very long time, for years on end, and we're starting to see the psychological effects on these young children, and how is that affecting our economy in the future? If we want to just talk numbers, hard numbers, if we want to speak to those people that care so much about the economy and not so much about the emotional toll, how will that be affecting our future economic model for this country is always an important question to ask. And, you know, I think it's also important for people that are watching, those that are based here in the United States, to actually understand that the migration of people and refugees is not just a crisis that is happening in the Middle East or in Africa. There is a refugee crisis happening here in the United States, and it's not spoken about. I've visited the southern border of the United States with McAllen, Texas twice. I've done a documentary about it. We had a surge of unaccompanied minors, as well as family units that were crossing into the United States that started in 2014. And that was families, mothers and children in particular, from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And those three countries were experiencing what is essentially a civil war, inspired by the United States drug policy and what we've done to those countries over our international war on drugs. And so the exodus of families has been tremendous. In 2006 and 14, it was about 50,000 50 to 60,000 unaccompanied minors have crossed the border. And last year, when I was down there doing another documentary, specifically around a mother and a child who had crossed the border from El Salvador, those numbers had actually increased. We were at 65,000 that was being projected for the year, 60 to 75,000 a year of refugees that were coming into this country, and yet that conversation is not happening. And we are also housing them in notorious and awful circumstances. In the United States, we are incarcerating mothers and children. They're sitting in detention centers. Some of them have been sitting in these detention centers for years, even though it is actually illegal to house a child in a detention center. Yet we've been able to skirt around those laws in some way. So I think it's important to recognize that the refugee crisis here in the United States is real, and the refugee crisis in the United States is incarcerating young children and their mothers.
And I think that's really interesting because a lot of the framing around this narrative, people don't understand fully what the push factors are that are causing people to make this journey and putting their lives at risk, but also what happens once they're in the country. So I also think, you had mentioned what was happening under the Obama administration versus what the current climate is. And even though we're seeing a lot more of this rhetoric in our faces in this current climate, there's a lot of policies that perhaps were in place from before. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit more and maybe some of the change that you've seen.
Well, first I have to say that, yes, under the Obama administration, we saw, I believe it was 2.5 million people were deported over 2 terms, which is an extraordinary number, high number. But President Obama also did a lot of things that were very much in favor for the undocumented community. President Obama signed an executive order, which was DACA, which allowed 700,000 young people, also known as dreamers, to work legally in this country, and also they were alleviated from deportation. So they were guaranteed that they would not be deported if you applied to this program. And there are specific circumstances that you had to abide by. You had to have come into the United States by a certain age, have been here for a certain amount of time. You had to have been in school, certain rules. But nonetheless, the Obama administration provided relief for 700,000 dreamers across this country. The Obama administration also, via an executive order, tried to put in place DAPA and DACA extension. DAPA would have given the same legal protections and the same ability for families to work in this country to the parents of American citizens. So if your child was an American citizen, yet you were undocumented, you could then apply for DAPA, and you would be guaranteed that you wouldn't, as long as you lived by certain rules and regulations, you would be guaranteed that you wouldn't be deported and you would be able to continue to work. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court in June of last year, and the Supreme Court actually struck it down. So that law or executive order was never able to get into effect. So while I do criticize President Obama for the amount of deportations he pursued, I also celebrate him for trying to make immigration reform happen in a way that, because Congress and the Senate were not going to actually make immigration reform happen via law, so he was trying to do it via an executive order. All that to say, today, where we are now, is that yes, DACA still exists, but because it's an executive order that was put in place by President Obama, Trump can destroy DACA tomorrow. He could just write an executive order and end it. President Trump has also put in very important executive orders that have been detrimental to the undocumented community. We know about the wall, which is the thing that everyone talked about. We also, less so, what wasn't talked about was in that same executive order, Donald Trump basically criminalized all the 11.3 million undocumented immigrants that are in this country. So when now you hear him say, we are only going after those undocumented immigrants that are criminals, that's who we're focusing on deporting, the executive order that he actually passed criminalized all of them. So that is why we're seeing that dreamers are being deported. That is why we are seeing that mothers are being deported. That is why we are seeing people that have been here for 25 years are being deported, because under this new administration, everyone is up for grabs. And that is the scary thing. And he's giving the money that he's giving to ICE, he's doubled that money. They're building detention centers with new detention centers down at the border. So the prison industrial complex is now being incorporated into the immigration detention centers. So it's everything we expected and much, much worse, to be quite frank. And again, I go back to this mental health issue. Like, we don't really talk about how this is affecting the 11.3 million undocumented people that are here on just a mental health issue. And that is something that we as a country are having to take care of, and we will have to deal with in the future.
Right.
And that is the saddest thing. We're talking about children, we're talking about American citizens, and we're talking about people that have been here for 20, 25 years, that are law-abiding, hardworking, people that are doing anything. And I think this is the most important part with regards to refugees and migration. They are doing what any one of us would do in their circumstances. There's not one person that would tell me that you would stay in Guatemala if your child was threatened to have their skin ripped from their bodies. And I've heard the story specifically. A mother told me that her son was threatened by the gangs, M13, and they were going to de-skin him the next day. And so she packed up and she walked to the United States in 4 weeks. Anyone would do that. And that's the reality. Anyone would do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maytha, do you want to add something, or we can?
I think Paola brings up a very good point about how preconditioning all of this is the hateful, xenophobic rhetoric, and how fundamental it is to criminalizing populations so that policies can be passed. So under Trump's rhetoric, that we were only too late starting to really publicly denounce, he was basically saying that he was criminalizing immigrants and refugees as rapists, women that produce anchor babies, and terrorists. So within that framework, you don't hear the stories of where people are coming from and how dangerous these journeys are. And so I think what unites across the board in terms of how undocumented populations are being criminalized, refugees are being criminalized, is this kind of single story around why they're here, or they're stealing our jobs, right? So I think that's really important for us to remember. And it's really interesting to think about the way that Syrian refugees are criminalized as terrorists when not one has committed a terrorist crime on US soil at all. And that shouldn't even be the precondition, especially considering the fact that most white males are responsible for terrorist attacks in the US. That's the basis for domestic crime. And again, it's if women are even talked about in the narrative, they're either producing anchor babies, or wholly invisible in the discussion, as you said. So things are racialized, and they're almost gendered in the way that they exclusively just use the imagery of the male.
Yeah,
as a foreboding figure.
Absolutely. And I want to move on to kind of talking about, women being able to tell their own stories in this way. Both of you have the experience of having a migrant background, and Paola as a filmmaker, and Maytha in your work as a writer, as an academic and an artist, you've really featured these narratives. So I really want to hear from you about what you've seen and the importance of speaking about these experiences as women who have gone through have seen different layers of migration, and how that storytelling can really empower a lot of women a lot of trans and women who have come through and been able to share their stories? What have you seen in that realm?
So my father is from Aleppo, Syria, and my mother, her family comes from this coastal city in Syria called Latakia that we don't hear much of. But she was mostly born and raised in Lebanon. She was displaced by the war in 1975. It was a civil war that lasted till 1999, 15 years. It was incredibly fraught, disastrous, and the sectarian divides continue on today. So I see not only the story of displacement and being a refugee in some ways through the lens of my mother, but the ways that the remnants of that still live. Right. So I think we don't even kind of think about that as part of the discussion. One of the stories that kind of stands out to me was an artist from Aleppo that I met in a camp in Chios. Her and her sister were traveling from Aleppo to hopefully meet with their sister, who they found out was dying from cancer. And so without their knowledge, their sister, when she was in Greece, was transferred to a hospital in France. And so they were stuck at this reception center camp and were not able to be reunited with her. And so eventually their sister ends up being undergoing tons of treatments and then eventually dying and passing from cancer. And so it was absolutely heartbreaking to this artist from Aleppo, who I found a connection with, being the fact that that's where my father was from, because she had made that journey just to see her sister. And at one point, she says to me, had I known this was the journey, I would have died at the hands of ISIL. I would have much preferred that than the conditions in the camp, being stuck here. She was speaking about how dangerous it was to even shower at the camp. And that's something that not a lot of people think about when it comes to women in the camp scenario, and the fact that she had to share a co-ed tent with a male, with her sister.
Absolutely.
Was not something that they thought she was going to sign up for. And her heart, it was so interesting. Her heart just jumped out of her chest when I was working with the Women's Center, as I mentioned to you, offered to buy her art supplies so that she could start drawing what she sees around her. And it was like we were giving her back life, just to be able to provide her with the opportunity to do her art in such a crazy, dehumanizing situation.
Right. And Paola, you as well, in so much of your work, women feature at the forefront. So can you just talk a little bit about the importance of sharing those stories from that lens?
Yeah. So stories that I came to the United States with my mother and my brother, and we came very typically to be reunited with my father, who had come a few months earlier. And a few months after our arrival, my father abandoned the family. So he left and never came back. And he left my mom with a 6-year-old and 3-year-old with no family. We were the first of our family to come to the United States with a couple $100 in her pocket, no English and no education. And yet my mother, through all that we lived through, we were homeless. I grew up on welfare. I grew up in government housing. Through all of that, my mother was able to create so much, create a life out of literally nothing. And through that, I saw the strength and the grit and the creativity of what it meant to be a feminist and to be a woman. And so, opportunity to become an artist, and when I decided that I wanted to be a storyteller, I knew that the stories that I wanted to tell were the stories of my mother, were the stories of the women who were around me in my and who we don't often see. And I like to call them the unsung heroes of America. They are the fabric by which this country has been built, and yet they are not seen. When we walk down the street, we don't think of them and we don't think of their stories, and yet they are the foundation of this country. So when I go in to tell a story, I try to tell the story anyways, of women, and I try to do it no matter the circumstances, whether they are survivors of sexual violence in connection to armed conflict, whether they are refugees in Kakuma, whether they are undocumented dreamers here in the States. I try to tell their stories in dignified ways, because I feel that the storytelling that often our communities, my community is given are stories that are exploitive, stories that are not complicated, stories that are not nuanced, stories that are stereotyped. So that is my focus as an artist. And I think particularly even more so where we are with the atmosphere that we're living in. The thing that, I mean, Trump has done a lot of horrible things for us, but one of the worst things I think that he's done, sorry, I'm going to move a little bit because I'm going to get to a nice, quiet place, is he's taken away the idea to be able to have complicated, nuanced conversations. Everything is binary. Everything is black or white. Everything is no, yes.
Yeah.
And so what we have to do and how we have to fight back with regards to that is really exploiting, and I don't mean to say exploiting in a negative way, really sharing those conversations in the gray, in the complexities of things, and that is what I'm trying to do as a storyteller today.
Absolutely. And I think just moving on from that, I just want to touch on quickly how a lot of these movements, especially for migrant rights, but also just, you know, women's rights, have been led by women. Well, women's rights, that's clear. But Paula, your involvement in the Women's March brought in some of these issues to the forefront. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about that quickly, because I know you have to leave soon.
Yes. So I was one of the organizers, national organizers of the Women's March. I was co-director of partnerships along with Carmen Perez, as well as the artistic director. And the beautiful thing about the Women's March, there's many beautiful things, there's many complicated things, but one of the things that I think is most beautiful was that it was a movement that was being led by women of color. And having women of color at the center of that conversation allowed us to really bring to the space the intersectionality of movements. So we were constantly being asked, well, if this is a women's march, why are you talking about undocumented issues? Why are you talking about the environment? Why are you talking about criminal justice reform? And to be able to really explain to people and to ultimately have explained it on a mass scale to millions of people, to say to them, this is a women's march. And because it's a women's march, I have to talk about undocumented community, and I have to talk about what it means to be undocumented, because women are undocumented, and that is a women's rights issue. And to really have that nuanced, again, that nuanced conversation was something that we were very focused on, because when we are intertwined with our struggles, then we will all be free together. And really trying to make the American people in the world understand this concept that is not new, that our freedoms are bound together. And that is one of the things that we tried to do. And I think we were successful to a certain point, but we were able to do that because the movement was being led by women of color.
Great. And, you know, just bringing in that intersectionality into this whole struggle, I think, is something that maybe is more of a new concept that's being talked about, because so much of this is tied to exploitation, labor issues, employment, domestic violence. There's so many different aspects to it. And Maytha, maybe you can talk a little bit too about what you saw in your work in Greece, but also just how some of that conversation is being led by women. I don't know if that's something that you can speak to.
I think the most fascinating thing that one observes when they arrive at the camps is how everything there is a consequence of wars, of financial exploitation by way of neoliberal financial models, exploitation, labor exploitation, exploitation around the labor chain and around resources and resource extraction. So everything that Western imperialism has been responsible for is literally at the camp. And so it's really interesting to me because I see Iraqis and Afghanis there, and Americans are so disconnected from what we voted for, where our taxes went towards paying for, and the consequences of that, because it's only in this moment hit European shores. So there's a disconnect around the ways that our policies have influenced global migration and created conditions that are unlivable. You know, Paola talked about refugees that are coming in from Latin America, and a lot of that is tied to what was happening in the 1980s around US government support for overthrowing regimes and support, and she could speak to that more than I can, supporting guerrilla factions and their involvement in the global connection of those wars. So I'd like to say that sometimes the quote unquote systems of domination are more interconnected than we are. So we have to do a better job of being intersectional and interconnected, because they already see us as that when we fall for the divisions, right? There was an executive order that was passed recently that pretty much connected Black Lives Matter and Indigenous rights movements by saying it is literally an offense to defend yourself against the police or tribal sovereignty security. And so that to me communicated that they saw us much more connected than we do. So again, like you see the discord in the camps, you see the discord around whether the Afghanis or the Syrians get service, who takes care of the sub-Saharan Africans, but it doesn't need to be that way. And I think what Paola's talking about in terms of the Women's March's vision for that kind of intersectional future almost always comes from women, because women have to see things intersectionally to survive. And again, you see that in the camps, and you see that with refugee women. As I said in Athens, in the Midwife Center, there's so much tension between Syrians and Afghanis in Greece, but you saw mothers who were holding each other's babies waiting for appointments. So there was so much beauty in the ways that mothers could see that they needed to be there for each other regardless of these divisions.
Okay. I think I loved what you said, that women have to live intersectionally to survive. I think that's really poignant and a great way to kind of, segue into thinking about what it is that you think we need to be doing right now in the US, but also globally. Like, what do you think that we need to be recognizing and paying attention to? I'll start with you, Paola.
This might seem obvious and maybe not necessarily what our listeners might want to hear, but it's what I'm focused on. And to me, my complete and utter focus is the 2018 midterm election. I jokingly said on Twitter today, I said, did he need to bring back vote or die? Because if we don't vote in 2018, we're literally going to die. And so I think that we need to be, all communities, women, men, people of color, those that can vote and those that can't vote, we need to be focused on how is it that we are going to put in some level of protection into our governmental system. And I'm completely aware that the Democratic Party is not our savior, and I'm completely aware that the government system is also not our savior. But coming from a community that is being directly impacted and is being directly threatened and is being directly destroyed by policies that are being implemented by this president, I also see the need to work within the system in order to save those communities. So for me, it is a matter of how does the wave of the resistance really take over the House in 2018 to give us some slight protection for those communities that are the most vulnerable. And I think it needs to be creative. I think we need the artist community. I think we need the political community. I think we need the strategic community. I think we need the activists, the grassroots. It all needs to come together to create an intersectional movement of resistance.
Absolutely. And Maytha, what about you? What do you think is necessary and needed right now to kind of address this problem globally?
So I come from an improv theater background, and we always say yes and. So I like to see things within the lens of multiple possibilities. So investing energy into that as well. So while I'm also really invested in what's happening electorally, we have to prepare our communities for circumstances that would be unfavorable to them as well at the same time, and also look to our most marginalized and most vulnerable for ideas, because they've survived
Mm-hmm.
the most trying of circumstances to get to where they are, to migrate, to be in transit, to move around this world that is almost stacked against them, right? There's 65.6 million refugees. And the thing that is against them is also this idea of nation state borders. So maybe we also have to start thinking creatively in terms of a longer future lens of what these borders actually really mean.
Mm-hmm.
Do they mean opportunities to militarize, to build walls? Or are they opportunities for us to actually turn them and make them porous? Because where did they come from before? They came from wars that wanted to carve out spaces of land. Do we want to continue to have ties to the land that are exclusively about ownership? Or do we want people to move freer than capital and commodities move? So I think those are the things that I'm interested in, is maybe even thinking about centering the refugee to dream of a future beyond borders.
Absolutely.
So that's the kind of work that I'm really interested in seeing people talk about, do creative, productive art around. And it's the stuff that I've been seeing in parts of anarchist Greece, where they've taken over abandoned buildings and turned them into squats for refugees that are completely free and they're collaborative. People create create meals together. And there's a dignity in also being able to be a part of the building of your own community, as opposed to being in a camp and receiving things from big NGOs. So there are these interesting sort of solutions happening on a local level, because there is a need to redesign social life.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to remind anyone who's tuned in that you can hashtag Talking Inclusion. You can use our Twitter handles and tweet at us it's at 19mm project, at 6 degrees TO, and at This is WorldTown. But if you use this hashtag, and if you have any questions for Maytha and Paola, please let us know. We have about 15 minutes. Paola, I'm just going to do a check-in with you. Are you okay to stay on for a bit, or do you need to exit? Oh, I think your mic is muted. Still muted. Okay. We will just sorry, Paula, I think your mic is still muted, but I love this technology connecting and trying to make it work, and women doing multiple things to make sure that this happened. I just wanted to kind of touch in a little bit more about some of the narratives that you have seen, especially constructed around the Syrian crisis and the refugee crisis broadly, Maytha, and just what have been the most prominent things, and what have you seen changing that? Because, you know, this kind of faceless migrant narrative is really prominent, and problematic, obviously. So we need to figure out
Right. I think there's always kind of two tensions happening. One is the facelessness of crisis sometimes, but also the hypervisibility and exploitation of faces that ends up happening as well, to serve causes or to serve large NGOs and their mission and other institutions. So I think it's seeing the difference between how the narrative affects people in Europe and the US is really interesting. I think there's something still so particular about seeing things on your shore, and the way things are narrated. So again, like Paola said, there are refugees here that are crossing in different ways in the same way that they are in Europe, but they're narrated either illegal immigrants or, you know, in a more sort of progressive sense, undocumented, but we don't think about their refugee process, right? So we don't think about it as being an issue that's hitting our shores. So what really affected folks in Europe was when the toddler, his body washed up to shore. That was a complete sort of shift around the rhetoric and the necessity of Europe to, quote unquote, welcome refugees in. And that's when you saw these amazing photos of Germans welcoming Syrian refugees coming and descending off of trains with food and clothes. But then a lot of that quickly evaporated, because there was a lot of attention given to the attacks that were happening across Europe, while at the same time, nobody cared about violent terrorist attacks that were happening in the Middle East or Africa or Central Asia. So I think there's this back and forth that goes on between how refugees are hyper visible, and then there's this hyper visibility of terrorism in Europe that is constantly like fueling discourses of welcome and refusal. And so it's really interesting to watch that transpire. In the US, because we're not so geographically in touch with what's happening in Syria, there's a huge sort of disconnect. But I will say, on a more sort of personal level, I've heard people from all over the US whose heart break and who feel really limited in their agency in helping, and want to know how they could help with Syrians and the Syrian refugee crisis. So even if there's a certain kind of narrative that is prominent in the media, mainstream media, or public discourse, there are ordinary folks, there are regular people who are ready to step up. We just have to be able to design a plan that is helpful for folks to follow. I was just at this dinner with Airbnb has partnered with IRC, the International Rescue Committee, and they're hosting displaced dinners all across not just the US, but Europe. And they've had some amazing outcomes around these refugee dinners, including people who taken up leads in their local community to not just welcome refugees, but change policy and turn their cities into sanctuary cities. So once there is this intimate connection and there can be a sense of feeling around who these people are versus statistics and versus like really faceless or hyper visible narratives, then that's when things change for the better, I should say.
Absolutely. I also just want to take a note that Paola had to leave. That's why we lost her from this call. So Maytha, it's just you and I right now, and everyone who's tuned in. I do just want to kind of check in and, you know, going back to what you said at the beginning and the specific challenges that women have to face when they're making that journey, and kind of the things and how wherever they land, it's not prepared to deal with them, whether it's kind of reproductive health or whether it's just their personal safety and the matters of exploitation that can happen. So why, maybe just kind of wrapping up, we can talk a little bit about what needs to be done to improve that specific notion for women and how to improve their lives, because these journeys are not going to stop. It's going to keep going. It's going to keep happening. So we need to really focus on what we can do to improve their immediate situation.
Oh, yeah. So we spoke a little bit about the media narratives around this influencing how policy changes. That's one thing. And then two, how people react and behave around refugees. So those are important things, definitely. But I think there's an intermediary point that a lot of us don't know about, which is there are these amazing unsung volunteers and self-organized groups that are on the ground, that are the frontline defense and frontline support for refugees. And so while organizations like the IRC, the UN, and Save the Children get a lot of attention for the work that they do, these other tiny groups get very little help and support, and they're barely hanging on. So I think the things that we could do, so let me break down a couple of places and work that people do and ways that people can support. There, as I mentioned, there's a midwife center called Amartel. They are providing reproductive support to refugee women. They were kicked out of their space because local residents didn't want refugees around, literally throwing trash on refugees that were waiting downstairs in line to get up to the facility. And the landlord, to encourage them to leave, was even the electricity on the elevator, and it's a 5-story walk. So can you imagine you're a pregnant woman walking all this way? So these sort of communities that are helping these women, needs our support. So one is that midwife center, Amritel. I know I'm going like really specific with folks, but these are some of the things that are really essential. Two, so as I said, there's this women's center in the island of Chios. They started this campaign called #MakeItSafe. And they asked women in the Suda refugee camp in Chios, what would it take to make the camp feel safe? As young as 12 years old, were commenting about the sense of danger that they felt as a young girl in the camp. So there is an immediacy around trying to help facilitate a situation that could be more friendly to women. So these centers are trying to work on providing housing for women, but they don't have the financial support. So I encourage folks who are listening to this call to, yes, donate to all these other groups, but really look into local organizing efforts that don't get that much attention. So Amritel in Athens, Athena Women's Center in Chios. Also, the only sort of project that is on the ground in one of these islands to educate children is called the Refugee Education Center. And they're the only ones educating these children. And I think that's something else we're not thinking about, is this generation of lost children who don't have any schooling or education. What's going to happen to them? Yes, there are immediate things that we have to be concerned about, especially like, as you mentioned, immediate things like pregnant women and reproductive health, the sexual violence that they endure. But what's our projection for decades later with what's going on? And also the embodied trauma. I do a lot of work around trauma. I'm going to go this summer and start a Yoga for the Displaced People workshop for refugee women who experience trauma and try to help them navigate that trauma. What's going to happen? When they move around, they're still carrying their trauma. Their trauma doesn't stay in where they're originally from. They're carrying it with them everywhere. And how is that going to manifest? And these children, how are they going to manage and deal with the trauma that they've experienced?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think what we're also seeing here is that there's, kind of a larger issue of how people have perceived this problem, how they're responding to it and understanding it. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we don't hear these stories. I think there is more of a push to hear stories specifically that are from the women that are, making these journeys. And I think also just understanding that there's so many factors, push and pull factors, that have really made this a really difficult and complicated issue. So I guess just to kind of close off for the next few minutes, if you could give us some of your key takeaways and some of your hopes for the next few years, and specifically as a woman, as a Syrian woman who is seeing this crisis unfold, and not just from the Syrian perspective, which is obviously dominating so much of that space, but from the perspective of, any woman who has had to experience displacement.
Yeah. I mean, a part of me understands and a part of me doesn't understand. I'm not a mother. I don't know what it's like to move around the world with children. Not everybody is moving around with children. Not everybody is a mother either. But those challenges I don't really understand the depth of, right? So any way to kind of connect to that is fundamental. Again, this is a global issue. This is not just an issue that happens on European shores. This is not just an issue that happens in the US. Actually, the countries that are housing the most refugees are in Africa and the Middle East. And that's something that we don't talk about either, is that Europe doesn't even not one country in Europe makes the top 10 countries that are hosting refugees. So when we try to think about who's taking on this burden, it's frequently countries and places that don't have the resources to, and weren't even responsible for the displacement of people. So let's think about that. That's one thing. Two, it's still quite interesting to me how we demonize people that are leaving, as Paola said, situations that all of us would leave. That's stunning to me. And women who even know that on these routes, in this journey, they face sexual violence as a very potential probability. They still do it. So the question is why? And the answer is always because back home is much worse.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. But in terms of the hope, even in all these scenarios, in this dire situation, you still see people living. You still see people giving birth. You still see people getting joy from giving you food. I cannot enter a refugee camp without somebody giving me food.
Mm-hmm.
As crazy as it may sound, I cannot enter, I cannot pass by a tent and not be invited in for tea. It doesn't happen. You see people getting joy from not just offering food, but cooking food from their hands. So I think that's another thing that we don't talk about, is how fundamental it is to allow people to create.
Mm-hmm.
Paola and I as creators also know that not only gives us life, but that gives everybody else life, whether it is art or it is just labor. That's a fundamental part of being a human.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we need to think about that, and also in terms of people's rights, is a right to not just receive, but to be the creator of your own destiny, to be self-determined, to have agency in your day and your life. So there's that. And lastly, as I had mentioned, the other hope I see is people, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, banding together outside of the state, outside of these large institutions, and helping each other. And you see it on the ground level, and you see it at the grassroots level. You saw it at the airport protests against the travel ban.
Mm-hmm.
There were ordinary people coming down and saying, no, not under my watch. This is not going to happen. So we banded together can do extraordinary things. The same as the Women's March, largest march in American history. Coming together, we can do extraordinary things. So I think we always have to remember the thing that binds us and think about a unity in difference, not erasing difference.
Absolutely. And I think that communing aspect is so important and crucial, especially in times like this. So definitely want to highlight that.
Thank you so much, Sana.
Thank you, Maytha. It's so great to speak to you, and thanks for putting up with our technology connected issues, but we made it. And I think this has been a great conversation, and hopefully one of many more to come. So thanks again. And yeah, best of luck to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You too.
Take care. Bye.
Peace. You too. Bye.